Good afternoon, everyone. How are we today? Thanks for your time. Today's a bit more of a streaming than a webinar because John's come all the way from the Sunshine Coast to be in the office today, so we appreciate your time, John. Look, the Australian government data breach notification laws will be effective from 23rd of January 2018, or February, pardon me. You need to be prepared. Look, I've had a lot of comments in market around this topic, and there's a lot of uncertainty from the discussions I've had. So today we really wanted to just really drill down into the new data breach laws coming in, what that means, how you need to respond to those, and some of the considerations. So you should get out a lot of today's session. So John Hughes is one of our long-term members and a specialist in the area. He's going to be discussing the new laws, what they mean for businesses, and how they're going to affect you. So without ado, over to you, John.
Thanks very much, Ross. I'd just like to say g'day to everybody and thank you for attending today's webinar. As Ross said, it's being hosted here in ACS Brisbane office, and I trust that you'll actually get something from this today that it might enlighten you in some way, shape or form for what's pending for next year. So just to summarise today, I'll cover the history of global data breaches, and there's been many of them, and some of them good and many of them not so good. In particular, the new notification laws being introduced in Australia next year. And that's something that we're unfamiliar with. I guess in the past, there's been breaches and nobody seems to know about it, but I guess we're all going to find out about it in the long term. The risks and the costs of data breaches, which are usually unpredictable and can be extremely expensive and catastrophic for some organisations. We need to look at also preventing and responding to the data breaches by astute management protocol. And it's no longer, I guess, an IT function. It really comes back to senior managers and directors in companies to make sure that they have the right procedures in place to circumvent or try and manage the actual data breaches. We also look at compliance with the new notification laws that are going to apply from the 23rd of February next year. And finally, some industry examples of data breach exposure risks and their relevance, because there's a lot of people that have interpreted the laws so far to think that it doesn't belong to them and it's not an issue for them. And it's very surprising when we reveal exactly how many industries and organisations it will be affected. So the reason for this webinar was the introduction of this new federal privacy and data breach laws which take effect next year. And it's a two-stage component because the privacy laws or act has been changed to suit this particular situation. And then data breach laws have been added as well, and it was bipartisan support, so it doesn't look like it's ever going to change. The national press announcements have detailed changes, and this presentation outlines the management impact and suggested appropriate responses which businesses may follow to limit their exposure and liability in the event of a data breach or loss. So just a brief history of myself from experiences and exposure to data breaches and strategies I've used to publicly manage system failures, which is in the past, I guess there hasn't been too many data breaches for me personally, but there have been systemic failures. And my aim has always been to build in resilience in all IT business solutions that I've provided for clients. And I think if we start off by doing it on that basis, we'll always find we've got a resilient system. In particular, creating business continuity plans in the enterprise space has given me the insight to scale these concepts for SME clients. In the past, it was always thought that business continuity was something that was applicable to enterprise, but it wouldn't scale to SMEs, and that's actually incorrect. It scales very, very well. The same processes are used, and it's just a matter of tailing it and staging it for these people. And in the past, numerous disaster recovery projects and troubleshooting system failures has helped me to design resilience when rebuilding from a disaster, and I've rebuilt quite a few. I guess managing systems integration projects in disparate systems developed a real test of my skills in the past. as there was many disparate systems. It's a lot easier these days, I guess. And finally, educating small, medium enterprises and corporate executives in plain English is going to help assist management to understand the importance of a resilient IT system or solution for them. So I guess it'd be a good time to pose a poll question, right?
Yes, get that going. All right. Yeah. So why is reporting important? Okay, why is data breach and loss now of national importance? It's nice to be able to do because there's a new federal law and not sure. And just remember, any questions that you may have throughout, just put them through the Q&A function there.
We'll have a look at those at the end. We've got a bit of time.
Yeah. Okay, so 81%, I'll share that with everyone. So about 82% said right. Yeah.
I guess they understand how important it is.
Yeah, there's a federal law, that's about it. I know the feeling, yeah.
So in particular, data breaches and losses have always been important, especially for an organisation because they've suffered personally. But the new legislation approaches to protecting individual privacy and data and intellectual property being publicly exposed. And we've seen quite a lot of that recent times. In 2018, Australian entities will now for the first time have to publicly notify data breaches and losses to comply with this new legislation. And the most critical component of any entity having a breach or loss will be managing the event, because everybody's talked about an event, but nobody's really concentrated on how to manage it. And that's just where I spent probably since late last year when I saw the legislation being formed. I started trying to get a grip and understand it. And as the last, probably the last 6 months, that legislation is still being changed. There was a July update for it, for example, that I'm trying to keep on top of. So, and that's a work in progress for me at the moment, and also for everybody, because I don't know how the lawyers are going to cope with this, but I guess it's a good revenue earner.
So, and what you're saying too is, you know, whatever we discussed today isn't set in stone, so to speak, and you still need to monitor this. So we're only kind of touching on where it is at this stage, you know, at say the end of September 2017, just to put a caveat in there.
Yeah.
So just remember, this will change and you need to keep an eye on it as well. And we'll try and do an update just before this goes to market as well.
So to give you some idea of my estimates on data breaches and losses range from a conservative $8,000 for one event, which is in a very small situation, to around about $250,000 for an incident. And that's just from my client base that I deal with, which is these days mostly in the SME space.
Actually, we've got is the entity cost correct, what you were saying there before?
As far as when you say the entity cost, are you talking about?
Sorry, just going back here. Individuals.
Yeah. Like this is maximums, of course. But if you're an entity, and I gave an example of an entity being a doctor in a surgery with a nurse that might come in and he practices, and he's got health records, he's got all sorts of things at his disposal, and he's storing these, and all of a sudden he gets broken into and his computer gets stolen and all the health information has been lost. And if he doesn't go along with it, he can be exposed to that sort of a fine as an individual. And then organisations that are, you know, public organisations, they're really the ones that are going to have to wear fines up to 1.8 million.
So he's saying this is going to be, as much as it's an individual's going to get fined, the organisation will as well, and they're the ones that have got to monitor this and control it more.
Well, it either applies to small businesses where there's an individual just running a business. It might be a sole proprietor, he might be a standalone proprietary limited, he might be a consultant like myself. And so, you know, as far as I'm concerned, if I'm going to expose some of my clients' data because I'm a single entity, therefore it will own. My maximum fine could be up to $350,000 if I don't notify within 1 month, which is what the law states. And we'll cover that in further detail as we go. Additionally, I guess we look at not just the actual incident, but also in the case of some companies, it might be the loss of their share price.
Wow.
We also look at confidence that clients might have with that company, or maybe even suppliers. We look at the reputation that they're going to try and maintain after they've had a breach that has been publicly notified, and how this may affect them. And so this gets a little bit hairier, I guess, as time goes by. I always find that it's unknown where some companies and their senior management will be able to survive these sort of announcements of a data breach or loss. So we need to ask ourselves what the consequences would be if you were, for example, an executive of an entity which is suffering a data breach or loss. So we find that the fines are maybe scary for some, maybe not for others. Entities with substantial financial reserves may just ignore the fines, and yet the loss of share value and reputation or impact could be completely opposite. And so that could really be devastating for the company. So maybe $1.8 million for a very large corporation is nothing, it's chicken feed to them, but their loss of share price. And we will give some examples of that as well, and there's been a few. So as far as the law is concerned, the message I've got at the moment, are you right with this? Is so the message I've got at the moment is to prepare now for the start of a data breach or loss notification laws. And we could prepare later, but we need to prepare now. And the only way to prepare for it really is to set in stone, I guess, procedures and protocols to try and secure our environment. And this will make us take a hard look at it now before the actual law comes into being. And the important date, of course, is 23rd of February next year. And fines for failure to notify are substantial, as we've just discussed. And they're per event or incident. So therefore, if you have multiple incidents or events, this can start adding up. And this may make people start to become more prudent and diligent in the way they manage their data breaches and losses in the future. So my interest in particular is the alarming complacency among entities, whether they're government or ASX or privately listed companies, individuals and sole traders, when a data breach and or loss has occurred in the past. So for the first time in Australia, directors and board members and executives and business owners are bearing the full weight of federal law enforcement whenever data breaches occur within their entity. So they can't ignore it anymore. And the interpretation of a data breach or loss legislation that's coming in next year and the extent of its effect and response to events must now be taken very seriously. So business service restoration time after a data breach or loss occurs is really critical. And that time, the shorter that time is going to be a benefit to all concerned. And finally, protecting the entity's reputation while publicly managing the data breach announcement is forever critical for any of the entity's long-term survival after an event. So maybe now's a good time for a second question to give out to the audience that they might like to consider at the moment.
Okay, so when does it matter your size, type and nature of business? And we've had a few questions come in for this, so that's why I've kept them around state government, non-for-profits, who's a result, whether it's an ABN holder or the entity. So this will be a really good sign, this one.
Looks like we're getting, it's fairly even at the moment.
Yeah.
This is interesting.
Does it matter?
This is very interesting.
These are great, yeah. Really, really good. Give it another second. Most of these have voted. Okay, so yes.
Neck and neck.
Neck and neck nearly.
It's a draw.
Yeah, we'll share those. So yeah, just in front's yes. So it does matter the type. No's not far off it and not sure kind of makes up the difference. John, what's the right answer?
Well, to be revealed.
Yeah. Oh, you can't do that.
We could always wait for everybody to wait till the end. Well, look, it does matter.
Yeah.
In particular. And in some cases, it doesn't matter that everybody is really exposed. So that actual answer is right for both yes and no.
Okay, yeah.
And this is why it's a real conundrum right now, you know, we're really waking up, I guess, to this legislation and our interpretation of it and how we're going to actually run this is really going to be interesting to see how it pans out.
Yeah.
And we can take some examples from overseas, for example, too. So we start to look at what I call major data breach losses.
Yeah.
And so in particular, I want to look at the past and present losses. And for me, it started with New York and when 9/11 attack occurred in 2001. And at the time, this was my first experience of a major, I guess, data breach or loss. And in particular, you could call it a data breach and a loss because it was both, as we'll all attest to. Yeah. And if we don't remember it, we can always go back and look at the particular coverage of the event. And so we need to, for me, it was assessing the impact of that and learning lessons, and then commence building a knowledge base in the enterprise space, which is where I was working at the time. And I worked in the enterprise space for around about 5 years in business continuity disaster recovery. So this gave me a really good insight. And even though I didn't have any events to manage that were quite in this scale, and I don't think very many people will ever, apart from those people that were in New York at the time. But as the scale of this catastrophic attack was being absorbed, it quickly became the most significant example of a severe data breach or loss incident. And so in terms of recovering from that, this one event rewrote the business continuity record book for me and for a lot of other people around the world. And no longer could entities go and store their backup tapes, which is what they were using at the time, across the road in a bank vault, as all these storage repositories were also affected. And therefore, it wasn't just a loss in the building, it was a loss of their actual backup data in some cases, or in most cases. So the 9/11 attacks did affect nearly all nearby bank safety deposit boxes, which is where all the important confidential information was stored for a lot of these organisations that were in these towers, which in many cases completely destroyed many organisations' backup data and their whole business. Yeah. So, and I'll move on to, I guess, some more recent examples of data breaches. One that I picked up on fairly recently was Verizon in the US. At Verizon, as many as 14 million records of their subscribers who had called their customer service in the past 6 months were found on an unprotected Amazon storage facility controlled by a third party. So in this case, Verizon had no direct control of this specific data, but it was still their responsibility. And sure, they can turn around and say, well, it's somebody else's fault, but they are the company that were breached. Wow.
So that's an interesting point.
Yeah. So who do you trust?
Yeah. So it's also, you've got to consider your supply chain.
Absolutely.
With this, because
absolutely.
They kind of come into the whole picture with this. You know, and we're talking data breaches, but it's almost, you've got to take that step back. If you haven't got a cyber security strategy, you've got to go there first. Yeah. Yeah. Wow.
And don't forget that. You know, originally 9/11, they all controlled their own environments. There was no cloud as such as we use today. There may have been some private clouds. And there was certainly private data systems that were out there for those companies, a lot of them in particular. So that's really scary. Then I guess we come to WannaCry, and that's been very publicly broadcast this year in particular. So it's been reported that WannaCry ransomware was only successful due to a lack of security updates in the Windows operating system. And in particular, it seemed to be focused really on Windows 7. And even though Windows 10 is out and Windows XP, there's still people trying to use it unprotected. They were very fortunate in some respects, the people that designed this attack, to be able to capture so much. And most of the commercial world is still in Windows 7 land anyway. So the malicious code at the heart of WannaCry was apparently stolen from the NSA originally. And it was then repackaged by cyber criminals. And then it was unleashed onto the world for a cyber attack that now ranks amongst the most disruptive to businesses globally thus far. And in particular, it seemed to cover just about every corner of the globe. And I forget how many countries that was, but there was more than 100 countries that were affected by it in some way, shape, or form. So this is no longer just an isolated situation. It's getting more serious by the day. So some of the larger events this year, and I say larger because I guess it's hard to say that WannaCry wasn't large enough, but one in particular, which I guess I have a bit of a association with, which is airlines reservation systems, which I've spent probably about at least 7 years at the forefront of software development in those systems. And Sabre is an airlines reservation software that's been used, in particular coming out of the US. It was very American oriented. It tended to be the default American airline reservation system that was for American Airlines and a whole bunch of others that were there. And they had a software breach. And what happened was Sabre Systems quietly revealed that it had been attacked earlier this year. And the software is used in particular by hundreds of airlines worldwide. And then thousands of hotels managing passenger and guest reservations, and then revenue management as well. And there's an awful lot of money that circulates in the airline reservation ticketing part of the world. And then human resources. So several major companies, including Google and Hard Rock Hotels and some Trump properties, revealed that they had had data stolen as a result of this Sabre breach. And another one, I guess, that's very recent, as of about 2 weeks ago, I think, from memory, or maybe 3 weeks ago, it really came to light that Equifax had a data breach this month. And they're a credit rating agency, a bit like what we have in Australia. We've got about 2 or 3 main agencies. Well, these guys are probably one of the biggest in the US. So when we look at them, it was considered to be a mother of all hacks. They have approximately 143 million users who were affected by that data breach, involving extremely highly sensitive and personal information. So we know that we get credit checks, they know everything about us. They know what our bank details are like, any past credit history. They know all our phone numbers. They know who we are. They've got a complete portfolio, I guess, of people's profiles. And this is what was hacked at the time. And the company fumbled its incident response earlier in the year. And they tried to actually do something about it and remediate it, which didn't work very well. And its data breach checking tool didn't work, and the company was forced to pull a clause from its site that effectively prevented aggravated customers from suing the company. The resultant outcome is yet to be realised. And that's probably going to be one of the most serious ones for this year, at least. It started this year, earlier this year, and has continued on. So much so that I believe that there's been more than one resignation, and share price, I think share price has lost around the last time I looked, which was about a week ago, I think it lost over 50%. Oh. So that's a very expensive exercise. And I'll turn my attention to another quite interesting case as well. And this is probably the most embarrassing data breach in history. And it comes from a Canadian company called Madison. And I don't know whether any of you are familiar with this, but I won't go into the gory details, but this company prided itself on protecting its private clients' personal identities. So much so that most of the clients wanted to protect their own privacy by using alias names, alias emails. The only thing they couldn't use that was on alias was their credit card. And that was the link that would tie that information and expose all of them that they were using this particular service, if you like to call it that. And this particular company had something like about 3 major companies in this arena. And it's crucial for organisations holding personal information electronically to adopt clear and appropriate processes, procedures and systems to handle this information security risk, and then supported by adequate expertise, both internally with their own organisation and then externally, which is really contractors or other companies that they might use or partners. Yeah. So actually Madison failed to act when their database of clients was stolen in 2015. So that's 2 years ago it's taken until now, and they're still involved, or they have been up until July this year, involved with the Australian government or federal privacy issues, because they had a lot of clients in Australia as well. And so these clients' very private details were published online, and their case has been ongoing for 2 years, as I said, and the long-term effects are still unknown. And in particular, if you have a look at some of the news, and I did drill down, there's been suicides, divorces, and all sorts of ramifications for this. And it just so happens that Sydney Airport was able to avail me yesterday of another nice incident at the airport, where they had a power outage, first of all, around about 4:35 in the morning, just before they were ready to start operating 6 o'clock flights out of Sydney Airport. And when they had the power failure, it looks like one of their systems didn't reboot correctly or come up, and it was affected by it. In particular, it was to do with radar navigation systems. And it highlights the need to secure utility systems like power. And people sort of think about their firewalls and they think about data security, but they don't always think about the basics, which is light sometimes. They might need lighting to get around. It's dark. They can't see where the problem is if they have a failure. They don't have emergency lighting. You know, they don't have their power backed up. They haven't got motor generator systems. And even in small situations, it's easy to manage these situations. So this failure delayed and prevented passenger flights nationally on the first day of the New South Wales Victoria school holidays. I'm sure that wasn't welcome at all by a lot of the people. And again, who knows what the cost is? It is immeasurable what effect that has to a lot of people's lives. So if we start looking at the forecast for this year, way back in 2016, it appears conservative compared to the actual. And there's been a lot more incidents now, and we've got a few more months to go, so I'm sure that the statistics are building. And so the real statistics of data breaches globally and then in Australia will finally be revealed when these new laws become effective next year. So to date, we really don't know. Nobody's been game to tell. They've all swept it under the carpet. So the actuals from 2017 will definitely exceed the predictions with what I've just focused on there.
Got a fair few good questions actually coming through. We'll get onto these shortly.
Yeah. So if we start looking at the next slide. Yeah. So if we examine and compare data breach loss legislation in Australia, the change is comparable to the implementation across Europe at the moment. And the US has already had law for a long period of time, since 2002. They're, as we know, we read in the press about US data breaches for a long time. And it's only because they've had law that they've had to disclose it. In particular, because UK is now supposedly divorcing from Europe. They've looked at the European legislation that's coming in next year as well, and they've decided that they'll actually take that as a template, but they'll actually increase it well and above what Europe's doing. And I think that the UK wants to see themselves as a financial secure environment for Europe, which they would still like to maintain even when they do Brexit. So at this stage, it's unknown how it's going to be. I haven't spent a lot of time looking at the UK legislation, but it's going to be a lot more severe than what we're putting up with in Australia. So we're taking a pretty light stance on it at this stage. probably because they don't think it's important in Australia, really. So it appears Australia is only aligning itself to the rest of the world. And in particular in the US, they have a thing called NIST, Cybersecurity Framework. So they've already built this framework. That's something which I guess will start to happen in Australia. I hope the legislators start looking at that now. And I would hope that when the legislation comes in that they might actually have a framework ready to go. I'm not seeing that unless somebody knows something that I don't at this stage, and I'm sure there may be something happening. So I guess the first thing to do now that we've talked about all the semantics is really we want to examine the definition of a data breach or a loss, given real world examples. And so in particular, I guess it was very hard to distill what was, after reading 60, 70 pages of notations from the government, from different industries, from legal sources. How do we actually condense this definition? And I tried to get it as simple as possible, because if we, the KISS principle is to keep it simple. And in this case, this is as good as I got.
Yeah, no, well done.
Okay, so this was my interpretation of it. Please don't hold me to this, because I'll be crucified. Yeah. And this is only at this point in time. I'm sure by the time February next year turns around, that could change. So my definition is just the unauthorized access to and unauthorized disclosure of or loss of personal information held by an entity.
An entity, again, is...
An entity, so it can be a sole trader, it can be a business of any sort, ASX listed, it can be an international company, it can be non-for-profit. It doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. If you've got data, you're counted in this.
If you hold somebody else's data, intellectual property, personal information, and that data gets exposed in any way, shape or form, then you could be liable to this law. This law can apply to you, and therefore you really must, first of all, secure it, and secondly, make sure you do the right thing by those people, meaning every client that you've got.
Clients, and the individual and the entity are both liable from a financial and
we saw that. $360,000 for an individual. I don't think there's many individuals that would like to pay that.
No.
Not that I don't know many anyway.
I don't know
whether you do.
To be honest.
So if I look at the unauthorized access, because that's, I think, I tried to get some sort of understanding of what that really means. And so we're talking about hacking, and it might be an employee that might be disgruntled in some way, shape or form. And it may be a contractor that wasn't happy with losing the contract, but they maintain some information from that company. It could be a ransom demand of some sort. And, I guess we saw the Russian ransoms, and there's been various ransoms in the past. I use the term open view. And what I mean by that is, if you're sitting somewhere in a public space and you've got a computer open and you're doing company business on that computer and somebody's looking over your shoulder, you are actually unauthorized, giving people unauthorized access to that information. And we talk about email all the time, email hacks and breaches of email. And I'm sure there's more, but they're really the highlight, I think. And then we talk about disclosure, because in many cases, if you're dealing with corporations, there's non-disclosure agreements. And those non-disclosure agreements normally apply to contractors or maybe employees. And they've become fairly standard in the past. And then we get into file sharing. Well, that's another world again, because these days we're file sharing with not just SharePoint in organizations, but we're also Office 365, which of course is maybe using SharePoint underneath, depending on how it's established. And we're talking about all the public cloud sharing facilities. And who knows where that data's stored, who knows who's got access to it, a system administrator I'm sure has. Whether it's encrypted, whether somebody's got the ability to unencrypt it. We're talking about public clouds, and there's lots of them at these days. And the real thing that's important about public clouds is that there's no what they call SLAs or service level agreements. So even though we store this data and it might be on SharePoint or it might be on Office 365 or it might be on a public cloud, where is the documentation we have from these guys to actually say that there is a service level agreement to say if the data's lost, it'll still be safely stored somewhere else and replicated, and therefore you won't lose it. And I don't think I've seen a service level agreement, unless you want to pay them a lot of money. There is no service level agreement with all this. And then social media. Well, what a can of worms. So
that's another story.
That's another story. Yeah. So I think that, you know, we need to look at social media as being a real gotcha, I think, in some cases. And then we look at data loss itself. And, you know, you can have a USB key that can have some data on it and you leave it, you know, in a public place. Somebody picks it up and it's got, you know, financial or personal information on it. You might leave your mobile phones or cell phone somewhere. You've got obsolete systems that are quite exposed because they haven't got the security available. We look at storage failures as well, because you might have a storage failure and you lose all this data, and it might be critical medical information or whatever. Or maybe it's a contract that you've lost that's in the process of work occurring, and that whole particular job or contract that you're working on has to stop and cease.
So it's internal as much as it is external.
Absolutely.
And that's where I think that's what I've just picked up, because I was actually thinking this was probably more external focused and external factors, but
it's both.
You need to look inside both. Just as
Absolutely,
much.
Yeah.
Okay, wow.
And the worst part is that we find internally, we find in most cases where data is corrupted or lost or damaged, it's an internal person causing the problem.
Yeah.
And I've seen data overwritten or deleted or scrubbed in some way, shape or form incorrectly. And so, this is really, really serious. So, you know, in the connected world, the proliferation of application sharing, data resources and public cloud storage increases the risk of data exposure from worldwide attack. So the lack of security on connected devices and mobile appliances, again, opens up more potential, because these are feeders or fingers into data access to private controlled spaces, which normally aren't exposed, but can be breached quite easily, because our mobile phone has now got the ability to do so much more. So if we look at the stored data types at risk, I investigated many industries where personal data was stored and found it difficult to identify any one group which was outside of the legislation. So you can see on the slide a sample of the types of data stored by many of these entities and SMEs. And the most at-risk example I discovered was real estate agencies or companies. Here they have vital, identifiable client records were kept for sales and or rental contracts. Most disturbing was the lack of security in many of these agencies of both client birth certificates and passports and driver's licenses, and pay advices to know whether they, you know, the bank accounts were being debited at the right time. And they're taking money out of accounts in a lot of cases. They're setting up direct debits, and their financial records. And a lot of them don't seem to have clear, defined backup and recovery processes in place, because they think of themselves as a small business, and they'll store it on the drive, and they'll take it home on a backup drive, and they don't even know whether the backup's working. So the second glaring concern was, where is the data stored? And a lot of people don't even know where their data is stored. I discovered local storage was on servers and PCs, and sometimes it was public or private cloud. It was mostly without any service level agreements, as I mentioned before. To guarantee that the data is safe from the loss and secure from hacking is questionable. And then other storage alternatives were on outsourced systems where other companies are responsible for its security and access. So you might have a third party that has given you, it might be your website hosting, or you might store information on your website. They might not just do your website hosting, but they might store your email and everything else. You might have data storage with them as well. And where is that stored? A lot of times we don't know. So let's just look at entity response to a data breach or loss event. We need to really develop an action plan before the need arises, and this is not long to go, we've only got 4 months, to critically limit the harm to an entity or any affected individuals. So being able to immediately identify and contain the data breach loss will limit the consequential damage. And this is where it's really important. Time is of the essence. And that's not just for now until February next year, it's actually when the event occurs. So we need to bring together key personnel within the entity or organisation or business to contain business risk and evaluate the extent of any potential data loss. And in particular, you need to appoint a media executive, so to speak. And when I say a media executive, somebody that's going to actually be the person that will oversee the notification process to protect the entities against misrepresentation. And so we need to also look at containing and preventing future attacks. So it's imperative to ensure that the entity gains control of its data security. So in terms of the data breach loss and risk assessment, risk assessments have always been implemented, yet the one for data breach loss must encompass a broad spectrum to limit an entity's liability. So we need to examine the risk context. Is it really important? What sort of data is it? We need to mitigate the harm as soon as possible. We can't wait any longer. We really have 4 months to get our act together and make sure it's right before it occurs. Unless, if we don't, we'll pay the price, because an event will occur. Whether it's minor or major, it will still occur at some stage, as it has, and it's not going to stop now. We need to really identify the individuals affected when an event does occur, and we need to evaluate the risks that we have in our business. And in particular, we need to minimise individual harm. And then something that's probably forgotten about is peripheral harm. And when I mean peripheral harm, we might affect one particular organisation with that data that were lost, or an individual, but that may then affect their family or their business as well. And so it can flow on a little bit further, and it gets a little out of control when we get to that stage. So if we look at this as being, I guess, the sequence of events that we want to do or use to comply. You're right, Ross?
Yeah. I can make a double click on everything.
Okay, so let's look now at data breach compliance or loss of data compliance. And in particular, these to me are probably really key steps, sequential, in an attempt to try and comply with the legislation as we know it today before it's implemented. And I guess if we use this as a template, this could really help us, give us a guide, so that in the long term, we may be a lot better off. And so that's just listing, that we need to identify, we need to limit the harm, we need to engage a publicist, and this is something which is really important. If you have a breach of some sort and you know how to publicise it in a way that makes you look better because you responded in such a way to actually limit the problem and get back on top and to make sure that it doesn't go too far, you can come out looking like you're being proactive.
Well, yeah, I thought that as well.
And you can promote the fact that you've done such a great job.
Yeah, it's actually a good
until
thing.
the next time.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So
Well,
you get one shot at that.
It doesn't matter, but you can set the stage.
Yeah.
And the opposite would that be to where you've actually had an event and you've mismanaged it and you're going to cop it, both financially as well as physically in the organisation. And then prioritise the actual entities or persons to be notified. And then finally your media release or announcement, because you need to publicly let all these people know that you've had an incident, which is all your clients and all your suppliers. And then you need to publicly announce it as well. So this is getting very embarrassing.
Yeah. And that's any time there's a data breach, like for any, no matter
Well, this
small business or...
if you qualify.
Yeah. And
okay,
that's
and like I say, I really find it hard to find an industry or organisation that doesn't qualify.
Yeah, well,
this has been the hardest thing for me to be able to say these guys don't matter. I thought of one, the guy that comes and does the landscaping and gardening.
Yeah.
Okay, he gets cash money maybe. He gives a handwritten receipt or no receipt. He knows your phone number. So his mobile phone gets lost and they find your phone number. Well, if you're Richard Branson, I guess maybe, that's a problem. But he might not have that guy doing his gardening. I'm trying to find, it might be, people at stalls at a markets or something like that. There is some that...
Anytime you take some sort of data, whether it be names, credit cards, so you almost need to go back and reevaluate your processes and systems and data capture prior to this, because if they're wrong, it's only going to make these data. You need
at least understand what you have got there?
I mean, it's pretty much common practice for us to take as much information on our clients as we can. But who actually sends anyone a birthday card? And do you actually need their birthday on file? So, if you don't need their birthday and their credit card, and there's two critical bits of information that will decrease your risks immensely. So you consider your data, what you actually need to capture. Yeah, wow. You're right.
Yeah, you're right.
Oh, just lots of questions. We'll get to these, don't worry. There's lots here. We'll get to the next one.
So, in particular, data breach preparation for 2018. So how many entities have a risk register? Some people don't even know what a risk register is. I've actually got a sample of a risk register. Maybe I can show it. I don't know whether you'll be able to see it clearly on the screen, but
there you go.
But this is something that all companies should have. And
there you go.
And it's something I didn't include in it because it's still a work in progress for me to try and set it out correctly for the particular type of businesses that I deal with. So that risk register should really contain your business strategy and competition that you have in the market, and maybe it might be exchange rates because you're at risk with exchange rates. If they change, your business is at risk. It might be fraud, that if you have any fraudulent events occur, what are the risks to your business? We need to look at testing of system resilience and the ability to fail over, which is usually tested when it's established. So you might say, yeah, we've now got a system, we can fail over to it while we're running, and there's no loss of business and business doesn't stop or stop in any way. But rarely is it ever tested thereafter. And so all of a sudden we go and have a system in place, and then 3 months later we decide that we're going to go and change things, and we never test it again. And all of a sudden system resilience has disappeared. We need to look at security policies within an organisation to make sure they keep pace with the business changes, especially with new applications and updates. And the worst part is legacy systems. And we saw Y2K many years ago. That was an example. And we're still in the same boat with maybe XP. There's still a bit of it out there. And then we need to look at an entity security policy. Do you have a security policy? Because it is critical, as the majority of data breach losses are attributed to internal compliance, first of all. And then who is the go-to guy for data breach management within your organisation or entity? And if you don't have one, you better appoint one. So, who's the go-to guy in the ACS?
Person,
you don't have to answer that, but I'm just saying, it's a good question. Okay. Which is really important, especially for the ACS, because I think we have to set the standard, so to speak. And then we need to schedule seasonal security reviews, plus additional actions to make sure that we can handle raised threat levels. So when I say seasonal, I mean once every 3 months is perfect, because we understand when seasons change, and that prompts us to do something about it. And it doesn't hurt. And even if it takes an hour of somebody's time, it gives management confidence. And we also need to make the entity's business continuity plan the focal point to address data security and risk. And does the company have a business continuity plan? And A lot of companies don't.
Yeah.
They think that they let the IT guys worry about it.
Yeah.
It's no longer good enough. It really is up to senior management.
Yeah.
So we take a last look at affected and exposed industries. And these are just some of the ones that I think are really targets to make sure that they have to comply with this legislation.
Yeah.
And, obviously the accounting and the banking and financial institutions. And how about aged care? All the relatives of somebody in aged care has got all their private details. Okay, or childcare. They've got the information on not just the child, but also all the parents as well. So if they're looking at doing abductions and I think back to the Irwins, for example, in Queensland, the reason why Bindi, who just so happened being in the same class as my son when they were in, first grade, had to be removed from school and had to be homeschooled. And that was because of threats to the school. And the interesting part about schools, and I'll just talk about that because this is a real case, that the school where my son went had 4 different databases.
Yeah.
So how do you manage and merge those? A lot of companies can't, or organisations can't do it.
Dealing with
so
a lot of schools,
they had a
they
had a database for people that applied to come to the school. They had a database for accepting and enrolling. They had a database for them when they were in primary school, and they had a database for them when they were in secondary school. And those addresses that might have changed in that time with parents were never updated. And so, but this happens in all organisations. They'll have a database for, the CRM, and they'll have a database for accounts, and they'll have do they ever mesh? So then I looked at automotive sales and service and rental companies. When you want to rent a car or you want to go and test drive a car, they'll take a copy of your driver's license and passport, maybe if you're an international person. And what happens to that? Who sees it? This is really scary. And then you've got sporting clubs and recreational service clubs and societies. And then you look at the building and construction industry. They've got to have passports for people that have got, visas or what have you to work in that business. We look at post offices, for example. Post offices now do the processing of passport applications. They're no longer government. They're private enterprise.
Is government departments included in this?
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
Why would we let them off?
Yeah, very cool.
Okay. And so training organisations, then I looked at the health industry, which is, hospitals and dentists and medical clinics and radiology and pharmacy, and legal firms and real estate agents we talked about, and security companies. They've got the codes for your alarm system at home. If somebody gets their database of codes, they can start breaking into people's houses, turn off the alarm, and they'll go, oh yeah, they must have set it off accidentally.
And when you start putting IoT into this, geez, it just,
Let's not go there. Let's not go there. We haven't got there yet.
Yeah, wow.
And I look at aviation, travel and transport operations, because these guys have got an awful lot of information on you. They're going to know where you are and when you're landing and taking off, and they'll know all your information. They've got all your passport information as well.
Yeah.
And so, travel organisations, that might be where you go and book your overseas travel, or it might be your local travel. They're going to have all that information too. So where is that stored? What do they do with it? Do they keep some locally or not? Do they divest of it finally? So we've got a poll question.
Got that.
And we're running really short of time.
Well, we'll be really...
so we will try and wrap it up in the next couple of minutes, guys and girls.
Okay, so... Okay, does any size entity have at least some private individual data and or intellectual property stored?
Well, I don't know whether that response is since we've been talking. I get a feeling it may be affected by it, whereas if we asked that at the beginning, we may have had a different answer. What do you think?
Yeah, I reckon. Yeah. It's a very grey area at the moment, isn't it? It's not black and white.
It's best to say yes.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Well,
it's safer to say yes.
We say that 85% said yes. So yeah, lots of everyone agrees with that. So I mean, we've got quite a few good questions here, John. I think we might just spend.
Can I just
finish
off with this one?
Sorry,
okay.
yeah.
So, in particular, the last slide, I think, is, prepare now for data breach notification legislations, which is what DBNL stands for.
Yeah.
I've had to stand for something.
Yeah, got to be an acronym.
So, we need to look at auditing to understand our environment. We need to establish our risk profiles and registers. We need to allocate resources, both human and financial resources, to make sure that we're going to be safe. And we need to look at our critical areas and priorities, and then implement changes and test the results, because we never seem to test, and then create a live security policy document, which is going to keep living and keep evolving with our organisation. And then institute internal training for all staff, because staff internally seem to be the cause of a lot of problems. And then publish these key strategies that we've ensconced. And then we need to get an independent review and update our protocols for data breaches as time goes by.
Yeah, lots to do, isn't there? Wow.
So I'd like to thank everybody, and we'll go for have a look at some Q&A.
Yeah,
you might have some that we can answer for.
You might for small business without personal, where an MSP provider manages their systems, where is the responsibility and accountability lie?
It's going to be a shared responsibility, I believe, at this stage, and it's really up to the lawyers to maybe start answering these questions.
Yeah, we'll look at getting an IP lawyer or a lawyer.
I would think that Hopwood Gammon, for example, would be able to help us out on some of these. Yeah. I would really like to see their response to maybe what we've delivered today. That would be great for all of us. I'm interested to hear their response as well. Yeah. So whether we can try and set that up before this actually occurs in February next year, it would be nice before the end of the year, but I don't know what our schedules are like here in ACS.
Nah, we'll leave that to the new year, to be honest. I think there's a lot coming through. When will the drafts be finalised?
You'll have to ask Canberra about that. I mean, I keep seeing updates. I've had 4 updates in the last 9-10 months.
And where can members find those, or where would you suggest is a good way to keep it up to date with this?
How many locations?
Okay.
If you just go and look at, I guess, the OAIC, if you just go and search OAIC, that will give you a starting point, because they're the organisation in Australia that wants to know about your data breaches, and you're going to have to register with them as well.
Yeah. And then this obviously law applies to ABN holders and contractors.
Yep.
Yeah, most
definitely. For sure. And all that'll happen is, if you're responsible for a company's information that gets lost, I'm sure they'll just sue you. That's all.
Yeah.
I mean, they're going to pass the buck, and this will always be the case. So, on that note, cyber insurance is actually becoming a new insurance that's going to be mandatory for all organisations that are going to handle or be controlling it. So it's going to be no different to public liability. You will need cyber insurance, and you do now. If you want to do work for councils or government organisations, they're now starting to ask for your cyber insurance.
Wow.
To make sure that you don't walk in the door and then expose their information. So therefore, they've got a $10 million or $20 million policy, not just for accidents or something you may do, but for cyber, because it's outside of the normal public liability.
Yeah, I've heard that's coming through a bit. And so this one's probably a bit more of a legal question, but if you notify someone in 30 days and not have any procedures, policies in place, can you still be fined? I'd say.
I don't believe so, but you must follow the protocol that the government's outlined, which is really to go and notify your clients and suppliers and publicly announce it and register it with the OAIC.
So what I'm hearing, and I've heard this, and we did this at an event a few weeks ago, and I've heard it now, is you do have to consider the fines and the repercussions, but your brand reputation is is where I'm seeing the most damage, or where I'm hearing this could be almost the most impact from a damage perspective, is not necessarily financial or business process, but it's more reputational and brand. And we know how hard it is to build our brand up and get that strong engagement. So having that contingency plan from a media perspective and from a comms perspective, being my background, I think will be absolutely critical.
It's all about trust. You know, we walk in the door to a bank or financial institution and we trust them implicitly. We walk into a post office and trust them with our mail, I guess. You know, snail mail we're talking about. And so it's all about trust relationships. So once we see that trust breached, no matter where it is in our business, you know, the first, we might spend millions of dollars building trust, and it only takes one event to break that trust. So this is why it's critical.
Okay. And will reporter breaches be publicly disclosed by the government?
I hope so, seeing that they're making up the legislation. Well, okay, it's federal legislation, and so obviously federal departments are going to be briefed on this to make sure that they comply, because it would be really silly if they didn't comply. It's going to expose, I guess, a lot of situations that they don't want to. And then you've got state government as well, and then you've got councils, and it flows on from there. And then you've got large institutions, which are like government in some respects as well. So I don't think it matters. I think everybody's got to be responsible. And so maybe this is a great thing, that we're all going to become responsible
together.
Corporate citizens, I call us.
Together. And look, this one's probably a bit more of a cyber security, but it aligns. So with so many different attack vectors, how do you stay protected? What's your cyber security strategy? Would be my first.
I'm not a security expert.
Me neither.
I'm only studying it from a disaster recovery continuity perspective.
With that,
you need to make sure that internally you have a security group or whatever, or go-to guy within your organisation. And I believe you need to contract somebody outside to audit that and check on that as well. And so you need to have some way of comparing it. A lot of people in the past have just said, oh, the IT department told me everything's okay. My backup's okay, my firewall's working, my data's now safe. I don't think management can rely on that anymore. This is now a C-level
cyber strategies for organisation. You know, it shouldn't be up to the technical team.
No.
Here's one for Aaron. What about AWS and Office 365 security compliance and the certification to various standards? They would be, and this is two parts of it, they would be required to have backups available in various locations?
It depends on your service level agreement with them. If you have a basic account with these, either with proper, what I call proper Office 365, which includes SharePoint and AD. Sorry to get a bit technical, but if you have that already, you don't really have any major SLA in place. But large organisations that are running this, so an institution that might have 5,000 or 3,000 seats, because they're spending so much money, it is something that's always offered to them, and I believe, depending on the amount of spend, that's something that comes with it as well. So, but for most people, no, I don't believe that you're covered at all. Sure, Microsoft or Azure, as we call Microsoft, or Amazon or AWS, as we call them, they've got pretty good systems. There's no doubt about it. But I go back to probably 2014 when I seem to remember that AWS lost 1% in a data center somewhere. And they don't know whose data it was. It was all mixed up with everybody else's, and they just went, oh, bad luck. And then there's other companies that have, they had a website that just disappeared. And so they rang the company and said, well, you were hosting it, where'd it gone? Oh, well, you should have had it backed up. All of a sudden their business is off the air. So SLAs are really important, or service level agreements are really important. And what it actually covers as well.
And so who would be responsible for data loss from mobile devices after an update or a hack?
Mobile devices, that's another situation that's it's still opening up worms, so to speak, in this. Because first of all, is it a BYOD device? Is it your personal device that you've taken into an organisation, and therefore it's caused a problem? This is getting hard. For example, I run a security application on my phone. and I run security applications, and I do scans and everything else. I've got multiple security protection devices myself. So I apply that. I guess I walk the walk or talk the talk in that respect, but I'm not a security expert. And I rely on certain brands to support me in that. And I go to their conferences to make sure I'm at least across fairly high, what I call high level security aspects.
And you're keeping up to date.
Well, the ACS helps me keep up to date. Industry forums keep me up to date. Industry conferences. You know, I spend probably 1 day a week on stuff.
PD, it's critical now.
PD
is critical.
Which is my own. I might take my own. Or it might be delivered. Whatever.
And if you recover any deleted or lost data, is it still considered a breach or a loss?
If it harms an individual or a company's intellectual property, yes.
So. Yeah, okay. So if someone's accessed it and they've seen it, they've seen it.
Yeah. Okay, so I take the example of a loss. So you're a medical practice and you do some surgery on the side. It might be plastic surgery, for example. This is a good one. And you've got all these details of what you've done in the past with somebody, and they walk in the door and they want to get some more plastic surgery. And you've lost all those records or details. So all of a sudden, what are you going to do as a surgeon? You're going to go, well, I remember I did this, this, and this, but now they want this done, and I might have done a surgery at the time that was their first one. I can't remember because I've done subsequent. I've got no record of that. You know, you're not going to want to divulge to the client.
That you've lost it. And this, I suppose, this one feeds in nicely. We've obviously focused quite heavily on electronic records, but does this still apply to loss of physical records, like forms, copies, passports, birth certificates, anything that you've got, in an office, and that comes down to internal also?
I believe that was already there.
Okay.
I believe that legislation has been in place. Always. But the fact that having to notify has never been there. So what do we do with records these days? We have physical records, but we scan them in sometimes. I look at most organisations these days, and I'd say 80% of their record keeping is electronic. Maybe 90%, and in some cases, 100% record keeping. They don't keep any paper at all. They've gone completely paperless. For me, I'm probably 90% paperless. Okay, 10%.
Most people are getting that way, and we'll just quickly race on because I know we're going over time. But these are awesome questions. Well done, everyone. How do this breach law affect outsourcing? So if you're in outsourcing, how does it affect you?
Well, I think they're in the same boat. That, they've got to have their data protection, security policy development in line. So when they go and sign a contract to say, maybe you're CSC or IBM doing a contract or whatever, you've got obviously procedures to follow when you go and negotiate a contract to say that you're responsible for it. If you breach that for some reason, then you're obviously going to be subjected to the same laws, and they'll probably sue you or whatever. It might be the council. What was an incident with council Tech One were wanting to be sued by the council, or IBM wanted to sue Tech. I can't remember now, but they were fighting over a council contract.
That's different discussion. So here's one from Kira. So do the government organisations, and it's two-part, have a data breach policy, and then can sharing the data to an unauthorised person come under breaking a code of ethics? And obviously when you're all members of ACS, you sign a code of ethics. So
I believe so. I believe so. Yeah. In my book, again, we really are now going to be dictated by the legal profession.
And I suppose
interpretation of the law.
That's going to be the next best thing, or the next thing we'll focus on. So what else have we got? Do the laws require disclose only the government or disclose only those affected, or both? I think
it has to be everybody.
Everyone.
So if you have a data breach and it may affect your clients or suppliers, you've got to let them all know. and you've got to let the government know as well that OAOC office within 30 days.
Yeah.
The hard part is knowing when the data breach occurred.
Well, here's one for that. If you are notified of a breach that had already occurred and you didn't know about it, are you liable for a penalty? So basically, you don't know it's happened, but then you're informed that it happened.
No, it's really from when you know that you've had a breach. So in some cases, that might be an IT guy, it might be a system administrator that knows about the breach, and he wanted to cover it up for his organisation because he might have got the sack. Therefore, it actually comes down to somebody in the company knew about the breach. And so senior executives in organisations and management really have to toe the line as far as pushing that policy down through the organisation to say, hey guys, we need to know every time there's a breach. We don't want you to just go and bag it yourself. We don't care who's responsible, but we've got to know about it. We've got to fess up.
Yeah, we do.
I guess that's the way I see it.
Here's one from Margaret, and I know obviously the government may say, Margaret's just done a bit more research for us. It's great.
Good.
So come under a Queensland Act, and they do not need to comply. So government, ooh, interesting.
So I always understood, and this is again back to the legal guys, that federal law really supersedes state law.
State law.
Now,
look, I think a lot of these are diving into the legal space. So we'll get it. I think we'll get it. Someone in the legal space to come and do something in the new year and really drill down into this, because obviously this is not legal advice, and we don't want to send you up the wrong path. Today was really about a bit of an overview and introducing you to the laws and how it can affect and how you need to think about it. And we'll do one last question. So data deletion is an interesting one. And this is what you're saying about people. Looks like a loss of data, but in fact, there has been no breach.
Okay, we need to qualify it.
Yeah.
Because data deletion, in other words, somebody accidentally deleted some data. So we still need to look at the effect and the harm that it's created with an individual or a company's IP. So say that data was deleted and that was critical historical information that might have been needed at some point in time to service a client or whatever might have been needed. So yes, it does qualify in that case in my book, and it's really yet to be tested.
And then I suppose this is where I think a lawyer's going to come in good is, does it affect the information disposal legislation? So we obviously spoke about the hard copies before and the disposal of that. Yeah, it looked really interesting questions. I think we're diving deep into this.
So for example, if you want to, say you've got a particular case where you want to dispose of information because after 7 years or whatever your retention policy is. Just flip that to the last one. To this.
Oh yeah,
that's right. So say you've got to dispose of it within 7 years. Then that comes under the normal requirements of disposing information. Because you've kept it for your particular policy, I guess, that you've got within your organisation, or maybe there's government controls over that length of time, or tax laws or whatever they may be. So that's really, all you've got to comply with. The fact that information, if it doesn't get disposed of and it gets into somebody else's hands, well, you've done, as long as you can sign off to say you've done the right thing and that this outsourced organisation actually broadcast this information, they might have found it in the trash, or it wasn't actually shredded. I'm talking about shredding, not physical shredding, but data shredding. For example, if I have a disaster with a client, all of the actual data disks that are extracted from that are corrupted in some way, shape or form are always returned to the client because they're there in their safe as a point in time that, there may have been something that we want to go back to at some point in time. So this is an individual case by case basis, I believe.
Well, John, I think we've asked more questions than we've almost answered, but that it's look, we've gone over a little bit today, but I think I think we've only had about 7 people drop off, so I appreciate everyone for
for their time, and look, it obviously shows it's a really interesting and important topic, and we'll start addressing this in more detail coming into the new year. But look, thanks for your time, everyone. I hope you've enjoyed it, and we'll put the recording up. We'll send out the slides in the next week or so, and yeah, we'll take some feedback for the questions that have come through, because I think it'll give us some direction on the content for next time. But look, thanks for your time, everyone. John, appreciate
and thanks very much, Ross, for letting me host this.
No, it's been great.
And try to give everybody a bit of a perspective.
Yeah.
And that's all it is right now.
Yeah.
It's a perspective of the way I see it.
Yeah.
Maybe it'll change in the next 4 months.
I probably will, no doubt, in some way. But look, keep an eye on it, and we'll try and send some articles and some content out as well. So have a good day, everyone, and thanks for your time.
Okay,
See you later.
Thanks for attending.
Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.